Peter Koval wrote at Open Democracy this week, "It is not surprising to hear the research findings which tell us that being lonely is the health equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, or that loneliness significantly increases the risk of premature death. According to the research by the Co-op and the Red Cross, loneliness affects at least 9 million people in Britain. The Campaign to End Loneliness reports that over 3/4 of general practitioners say they are seeing between 1 and 5 patients a day who have come in mainly because they are lonely." Now, late-night TV talk show hosts here in the States are scoffing at the idea of a ministry of loneliness. The Economic Times called it weird. How serious is any epidemic of loneliness, and what do you think happens when people are in denial about an epidemic of loneliness?
Well, an epidemic of loneliness is a catastrophe, and one of the people who taught me most about this is Professor John Cassiopo at Chicago University. He showed that, so when we're stressed, we release a hormone called cortisol. He found that being acutely lonely is as stressful as being punched in the face by a stranger. So loneliness is a catastrophe. It increases health risks across the board for everything, physical and mental disorders. You know, I'm somewhat cynical about a British Conservative government that's actually been massively attacking the social sphere, now suddenly saying, oh, well, we'll just create a minister who's going to solve the problem. It feels a little bit like a kind of Band-Aid, especially since they've been aggressively destroying collective institutions across Britain for pretty much all of my lifetime. So I'd be somewhat skeptical about that. But there are real solutions to loneliness. I think this is a real big driver of Trump and Brexit. I mean, I think a lot about as I explained in Lost Connections, in the run-up to the presidential election, 2016 presidential election, I was with some people who were trying to get out the vote to stop Trump in Cleveland, in a part of Cleveland called Slavic City. And it's one of those devastated parts of Cleveland that's like, Detroit without the poetry of the ruins. Obviously, crucial swing state. And I was with Dave Fleischer, who's a guy from a wonderful person from the LA LGBT Center. We were on this street, it's one of those long streets where a third of the houses had been demolished, a third were abandoned, and a third still had people living in them, often literally behind barbed wire. We knocked on this door, and this woman answered, who I would have guessed from looking at her was 60. I actually learned from talking to her, she was the same age as me at the time, which was 37. And she was very angry, quite articulate, quite an impressive, she knew quite a lot. And she said this thing that absolutely, we were trying to make the case for voting and everything, and she said this thing that really stopped me in my tracks. She was talking about what the area used to be like. And she meant to say when I was young. What she actually said is when I was alive. And I really felt knocked back, but it fits so much with what I've been learning from all these scientists all over the world. We live in a culture that's not meeting people's basic psychological needs. So in some sense, that does make lots of people feel like they are not alive. And she's not wrong to feel that way. And I have to say, I find it although I obviously think Donald Trump is an unimaginable catastrophe and a threat to the future of the human race, and I think Brexit is a terrible tragedy for my own country, Britain, we have got to stop patronizing the people who voted for these options. We've got to stop saying that it's just because they're stupid or they're racist. Some of them are racist. I actually don't think many of them are stupid. But we've got to stop talking like that. This is about a crisis of unmet psychological needs. And if we're just screaming at them, they're going to be even more angry and they're going to have even more unmet needs. What will heal this is connection and love and compassion. And we've got to be the love and compassion people. The other side is we're never going to win against Donald Trump on rage and abuse, right? That's never, you cannot beat him on that front. We can only beat him by talking in a different way, which is, I think, connected to all the factors that are driving disconnection and despair are the factors that are driving, I think, these weird and very disturbing right-wing movements across the world. Not entirely. There's a lot of other stuff going on, of course, but I think that's a big factor that's kind of underappreciated.
Another cause you cite for unhappiness, depression, and anxiety is discrimination from status and respect, and you write that humans have a choice. We can find practical ways to dismantle hierarchies and create a more equal place where everybody feels they have a measure of respect and status, or we can build up hierarchies and ramp up the humiliation as we are doing today. When we do that, many of us will feel we are being pushed down almost physically, and many of us will show signs of submission. We'll lower our heads and our bodies and silently say, "Leave me alone, you beat me, I can't take this anymore." So how much do you think increasing inequality is increasing the likelihood that we are unhappy, depressed, and anxious?
The research on this is quite shocking. So one of the ways into it that I had was through this guy called Professor Robert Sapolsky. He went to live with a baboon troop in Kenya when he was a young man, when he was in his early 20s. And his job was to find out through taking blood samples, when figure out when baboons are most stressed, right? And it turns out baboons, who are some of our closest evolutionary cousins, they live in a very strict hierarchy. The men do, the women don't, which is interesting. But the men live in a very strict hierarchy from, like, so say there's 60 men in the troop. Number 1 knows he's above number 2. Number 2 knows he's above number 3. Number 39 knows he's above number 40. And that determines things like how much food you get, whether you get to sit in the shade or you have to sit in the sun, who you get to have sex with, all of those things. And what he found was there were 2 things that caused maximum stress to baboons. One was when their status was insecure. So if you were being challenged for the top position, for example, and the other was if you were at the bottom of the hierarchy. And what's interesting is if you are at the bottom of the hierarchy, if you're a baboon, actually a lot of primates, what you will do is you will put your head down, you'll put your bottom up, and you just cover your head, which looks a lot like a depressed human being. There's a professor called Paul Gilbert who calls it the submission response. It's basically saying, "Leave me alone, you beat me." And obviously baboons, there's some variation, but basically baboons always live in a hierarchy, right? But human beings, the degree to which we live in a hierarchy varies. So the United States is exceptionally unequal. You've got, a small number of kind of inverted commas winners at the top, and a big number of inverted comma losers at the bottom. People are made to feel like they're losers. So you've got a lot, then this has been shown by Professor Richard Wilkinson, Professor Kate Pickett, you have a lot more people showing the submission response who feel like, I've been beaten, leave me alone, you beat me, I'm at the bottom of the hierarchy, I can't take it. We say that when we're depressed, we feel down. That is, I don't think that's more than a metaphor, actually. I think that's a legacy of this evolutionary impulse, and I was taught that by Professors Pickett and Wilkinson, and Professors Pickett and Wilkinson have shown really powerfully, and with a huge amount of data, that the more unequal a state, the differing inequality between US states explains differing levels of depression and anxiety to a significant degree. Different levels of inequality between countries explain differing levels of anxiety, depression. So inequality is driving. You just have to think about it. If you just spend the day feeling like there's a bunch of people who matter, who've got all the money, and you're at the bottom and you're being kind of humiliated and you have nothing, that's depressing. It makes you feel down,
Yeah, that's really amazing. The one thing I was thinking about throughout your response, that's why I was kind of slow to get back to the microphone, is if globalization, financialization, and neoliberalism, from your 9 causes, those seem like to be the bedrock of, for instance, disconnection from the natural world. That leads to, globalization leads to, and financialization leads to more urbanization as people are moved off their land, subsistence farmers are moved off their land, and the land is sold. So if globalization, financialization, and neoliberalism contribute to depression, to you, what explains why there is so much support and popular support? What explains why so many people vote for policies and politicians that support globalization, financialization, neoliberalism that lead to depression?
Well, I just want to be a little bit careful about this. So I believe neoliberalism is driving up some, not all, of the factors that cause depression. Neoliberalism is not the only system that does that. So Soviet communism, for example, in a very different way, drove up huge amounts of the factors that drive depression and anxiety. So I'm not saying neoliberalism is a cause of depression and anxiety, but that it feeds some of the causes. Do you see what I mean? It's a slight difference, but I think it's important to say that. In terms of why people support it, well, I think part of the issue, and I thought this a lot when I was speaking to loads of Trump voters, is a profoundly atomized society. We were talking about how lonely our society is. You've got a society where more people have no close friends they could turn to in a crisis than any other option, and more than half of Americans don't have $500 for if a disaster comes along put aside, right? Because they've been treated so badly by this system. That creates a real, remember what we were saying, there is an innate human need to feel you belong, right? And I think one of the things that happens is in an atomized, lonely society, you have a desperate hunger for belonging. And because we're not meeting that deep underlying cause by changing the way we live, it's very tempting to look for markers of belonging in politics, like whiteness, or don't misunderstand me, I'm not apologizing for this. I'm trying to help us understand why it's happening. Things like whiteness, or the kind of overt racism of Trump, or the kind of jingoism of Trump, or the Brexit campaign. I think that's a big part of what's happening, that people are looking to that kind of politics to meet these deeper unmet needs. Now, it doesn't meet those needs, right? It's like it's like trying to deal with your hunger by eating loads of candy. It'll actually make you sick. But I think it's not it's an understandable response to people who don't appear to be offered anything better. It's a tragic response, but I think it's an understandable one.